Now, looking at the Liberal response broadly to the pandemic, how do you feel about what Trudeau has done so far and, the CERB, the wage subsidy, now potentially 10 paid sick days into the recovery phase? What are your thoughts so far on what Trudeau has done and maybe what's influenced him to do many of these things?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the COVID itself, he hasn't done a bad job. He hasn't done a great job. I think he closed the border with the U.S. too late. He could have done it at least a few days earlier. That could have made a small difference. There wasn't enough testing and direction at the airports. Early on in this crisis, a lot of snowbirds were coming back from from Florida and California and stuff, and they were being asked, they were supposedly being told to self-isolate and that they'd get tested and all this. But when the CBC and other journalists were interviewing them, outside of Pearson in Toronto, none of them were saying they were asked. So early on, there were some key failures on the testing and treatment side. But that part's been decent. In terms of aid, a lot of that's been okay. But insofar as it's been okay, as you've noted and I've noted in Passage and other sources, it's been the NDP's pressure. The Liberals' original stimulus package, crisis package, was $27 billion. It's more than 4 times that now. And that's because what they originally proposed before interventions from the NDP and the Bloc and the Greens, but especially the NDP, but all parties, really, to be fair, it was a tiny package. The CERB was basically non-existent. They were basically going to try and let EI handle this, which would have been a disaster because EI is basically designed to not pay workers. Like, that's how EI works. Yeah. And the majority of workers, when they go unemployed, actually can't get EI because of all the rigmarole. And so the CERB isn't perfect. It leaves out the very poorest Canadians. It leaves out students. They created a new program for students, but it's inferior. But every step of the way, what's happened is the Liberals have dilly-dallied. Then they've done nothing. The people, the NDP, unions, progressive groups, individual Canadians raise a stink about it. And then the Liberals go and do something which is okay, but not good enough, right? So they create a CERB, which includes a lot of people, but leaves out, a million plus, unemployed Canadians. They create a student program to respond, but it's full of all these like loopholes and you have to apply for it. They talk about creating aid programs for workers, but it's not enough fast enough. And now we have the new provision, which is the NDP's call for 14 paid sick days. They want to do 10 paid sick days. So it's good, but it's only good insofar as they've been forced from the left to make it good because it's a minority government and because they realize that, going into the next election, Jagmeet Singh's young and charismatic, and they don't want to be able to give him the opportunity to say, the Liberals left you high and dry while we were proposing solutions.
Yeah, and I'm now beginning to develop this theory that Trudeau and the Liberals are doing all of this because they want to build this goodwill. And we have this story coming out where Trudeau is tapping bank CEOs to help advise him on economic recovery. So, I mean, my thinking here is, they're doing all this great stuff now, but ultimately they're going to say, well, now we got to go back to austerity because we got to pay for all this stuff. What are your thoughts on Trudeau tapping these bank CEOs to help him on his economic recovery? Do you think, are you as, are you thinking about this the same way that I'm thinking about this, that he's planning it in this sort of way?
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of people think of the Conservative Party as like the party of big business in Canada, but in some ways it's more the Liberals. The Liberals have the ties to like the banks more, the big like SNC Lavalin. Like Conservatives have corporate ties, but they're more like in the oil industry. Like the real like long historical corporate ties are more liberal than conservative in Canada. And it doesn't surprise me that Trudeau's going to the banks for recovery advice. Now that could be austerity. It could also be quantitative easing, which benefits the banks. Because whenever interest becomes free, banks can effectively print money and then still lend it out with interest to regular Canadians and small businesses. So it could be a mixture of multiple things, but it doesn't surprise me that Trudeau's reaching out to the banks. In terms of his political approach, it's actually kind of tricky. I think his goal actually is to try and win a majority government, which if the election was today, he might well win a majority, a big one, and then after winning a majority government, start the austerity and hope that again people forget, because there won't be an election for 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 years, and that would be his strategy. Now he has to get to that point. They could call an election now because it's a minority government. They could just let the government fall, but then they would look like monsters because they would send us to and no one's pulling the government down because the NDP and the Bloc see the polls. No parties have money. None of the parties have money. The Conservatives don't have their leader yet. So nobody wants an election right now. So the Liberals have to kind of time this where it's like they know they're going to do austerity. We know it. But if they do it before the next election, they're going to bleed support to the NDP, right? But if they, so I think that their timing is going to have to be very key. But I do think it's very telling. Now, going to the banks, again, doesn't always just mean austerity. It could mean public-private partnerships, which are, the public basically socializes the risk and corporations benefit. So Trudeau has shown that you could still be very, very pro-corporate and anti-worker while spending money, right? It's not always about just austerity. So it could be a mixture of a lot of.
Well, thanks again, Christo, for coming on. Plug your channel. Where can people find you?
Yeah, if people want to see my work, you can see it here on YouTube. David will have a link in the description, but it's just Christo Aivalis. If you YouTube search that, it should be the first or second thing that comes up. It's also just my name, all one word, on Twitter. You can find me there. You can also find me on Facebook. I have a couple pages and stuff there. Or you can add me as a friend on Facebook. That's where my work is. I also have written for the Washington Post, Globe and Mail, Maclean's, Passage. You can find that if you just Google me. But check me out on YouTube. If you like David's stuff, you should like at least some of my stuff.
You'll like all of his stuff. Christo does awesome work. Definitely check him out. I'll have all the links below the video in the description box. Christo, thanks again.
Thanks for having me.